people lived like normal people. They had hot and cold water. They had toilets that flushed. They had, heat. They had livelihoods. And I confronted my mother. I said, "Were you guys put in camps?" And she says, "Yes." I said, "Everybody was put in camps?" And she said, "Yes." I go, "How did you let that happen? Why did you let them do that to you?" They were rising from immigrant status, moving up the ladder to hoping for a middle class at some point. And all that is taken away. And we talk about immigration and hordes of people and infecting our country, and the word vermin. They said that about the Japanese. We're vermin. We breed like vermins, and filthy like vermin. So I see the word coming up today, vermin and immigrants. And so you think, okay, it's that same kind of infection that comes in. So this presentation is in memory of my Uncle Yohei. He was my mom's younger brother.
For 25 years, Barbara Berthiaume has been presenting to Rotary clubs, classes, community groups, anyone willing to listen. Even as illness wears on her, telling this story remains a priority.
When I give this presentation, people say, "I had no idea," or "I didn't realize anything like this had happened," or they knew just this much about it. So I think this is important. Obviously, I think it's important, and I hope you enjoy and learn some things as well.
Barbara tells the story of her own immigrant family, racial prejudice, the power of the press, and the valor and courage of an all-Japanese World War II fighting unit, the 100th 442nd Combat Battalion. She's learned that imprisoning and ignoring the rights of 120,000 people of Japanese heritage, 2/3 of them U.S. citizens, is being forgotten.
So I'm hopeful that my children and our grandchildren and future generations respect, honor, and understand our heritage, and have compassion for new groups, immigrant groups that are coming to this country and facing a lot of the challenges that our parents and grandparents faced. My grandparents came to this country at the turn of the century. So my mother is there with the little flag. So if any of you know people that are immigrants, they take their oath very seriously. They are the most loyal Americans you'll ever meet.
To fully understand Barbara's passion in telling this story, first one should understand her lifetime of experiences.
I was born in Havre, Montana, and my family moved to Idaho when they were released from house arrest. I think I was 6 months old when we moved to Beaumont. Lived there until I went to college. But we were the only Japanese family in our area. And so I knew we were different. I didn't know what or how or why. And I remember my parents telling me, "Don't do anything wrong because you're going to be noticed. And they're going to see you first." And so I thought, that's really weird. And fortunately, I'm the second child. So my sister heeded that much more than I did. But I could kind of tell who was racist, just a feeling. And who didn't like Japanese, just a feeling. And tested it out a few times, and I was right more than I was wrong. So it's just a unease that you have. We had a Christmas pageant, and I was really small for my age, and people thought I couldn't understand what they were talking. So they just talk in front of me, say anything. And I thought, don't they understand I know what they're saying? And so they were deciding who was going to be Mary. And so he says, "Well, why don't we let Barbara be Mary?" And she goes, "No, she has black hair. So she needs to be, I don't know, something else." And it really hurt my feelings. And we were playing free-for-all, and he called me a Jap. I was so furious. We got in this big fist fight. And he ripped my jacket.
Also as a young girl, she had questions about a picture and a letter her mother kept tucked away in a drawer.
I remember going through that drawer because I was always snoopy. I liked to look at things. But I was drawn to that picture. It was a 8 by 10. It was color. And I always liked that picture. And I think my mother must have told me that he wrote a letter. So I saw the letter, but I couldn't read or write. Fortunately, I scribbled at the bottom, but I didn't scribble on the writing of the letter itself. My mom did say that Uncle Yohei was killed in the war, but that was just kind of a, loose connection. It didn't land anywhere. It didn't give me any anchoring point.
It would be more than 50 years before Barbara would know Yohei's story. Life in 1960s southern Idaho was pleasant for Barbara and her family. She recalls the community was kind and supportive. Then, as she was about to finish high school, someone's offhand remark changed Barbara's world.
My mom and dad never talked about camps. I knew nothing about it until I was a senior in high school. They never said a word, neither did any of their friends. I couldn't understand how they let them hurt them up and put them in prison, leave all their belongings behind, everything that they own, their whole life, their dignity, their sense of self. I just had no background or any frame of reference for it. So I was just furious.
Barbara learned that right after Pearl Harbor, her parents, grandparents, and older sister had been incarcerated for nearly 3.5 years. They were among the 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry forced to leave their homes, belongings, and property for the sake of national security. 2/3 were American citizens, half were children. They were held in isolated camps behind barbed wire with guard towers in some of America's most desolate areas.
I decided I was going to explore more, so I went to the University of Idaho, and I was going to write a paper on the evacuation. Came up with this much information. That's added to this much information that I got from my parents. All through college, I didn't, University of Idaho, it's nothing. When I moved to Seattle, there was a lot of social unrest in the 70s. In the 70s, there was awakening of social consciousness on many levels. Black power, the Chicanos, yellow power. And so in our community, we started thinking, whoa, you know what? What's going on in our community? And the Japanese Sansei, third generation, were doing the same thing. Questioning, what happened during the war? What was it about? And, taking another hard look at it and deciding that it'd been whitewashed and that the terms for it, instead of assembly centers, pioneer communities, relocation, so just bland words that nobody would think anything of. It was really forced removal. It was incarceration. And actually, it was an American concentration camp. Roosevelt, in the early part of this whole business, called it a concentration camp until he found out what was going on in Germany and knocked that off. So I use the term incarceration because there's so much that gets associated when you say concentration camp with Germany. So even though it was forced removal, they were incarcerated, it was horrible, it was still different.
With her formal education complete, Barbara was about to embark on a career in counseling. But her mother, Michi, had other plans. There was more education to come.
So my mom says, Barbara, you should apply for this scholarship at Japan Airlines and Japanese American Citizens League. I go, yeah. And so she kept bugging me. So finally I did. I wrote an application.
And in so doing, Barbara would meet two people who would inspire her own activism.
Minoru Yosui was a good friend of mine. I had a scholarship to study in Japan in 1970, and he was a force, an absolute force to be reckoned with. He was a fiery orator.
I felt that we owed at least the obligation as a citizen to tell our government they are wrong. That is the sacred duty of every citizen. Because what is done to the least of us can be done to all of us.
Minoru Yosui was one of only 3 Japanese Americans who fought the legality of exclusion and detention following Pearl Harbor.
Min was like legendary in the Japanese community. So I asked him, I said, so how did you get incarcerated? And he said he just got out of law school, he knew his rights, And he said that they put a curfew on the Japanese. And he says, you can't do that to me. I'm an American citizen. They threw him in jail. They put him in solitary confinement for some reason. He never got a hearing.
For the rest of his life, Yasui continued to fight his wartime arrest record, as well as fighting discrimination beyond the Japanese community. In 2015, Minoru Yasui posthumously received the highest civilian award in the U.S., the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Also joining the scholarship group headed for Japan was a young and newly famous actor.
And I didn't know who George Takei was because I just got out of graduate school and we didn't have a television. So I had no clue who this guy was. And people kept coming up to him saying, George, what are you going to do next? What's your next project? And I'm going, who is this guy? And then found out he had some kind of TV show.
George Takei, the original Star Trek's Mr. Sulu, has been called a social media superstar with followers in the millions.
So I had no idea who this guy was. He was kind of weird. But we've been friends ever since.
To be summarily rounded up, with no charges, with no trial, with no due process. Due process is the core pillar of our justice system. That all disappeared.
Besides social media and speaking engagements, Takei has written several books, including a graphic novel telling his own story. Born in Sacramento, California, as a 5-year-old, Takei's family was removed from their home and forced to live in horse stalls in Santa Anita Park. From there, his family was relocated to swamplands in Rower, Arkansas, and eventually were moved to Tule Lake, California. At the end of the war, Takei's family found themselves on Los Angeles' Skid Row. No bank account, no home, no family possessions, and had to start all over again.
One of the things that he did, a quote that he did, I thought, shame is a cruel thing. It should rest on the perpetrators, but they don't carry it in the same way that victims do. And it's so true. When I think of my parents and how they never spoke about it, can you imagine the humiliation and the shock of being uprooted from your home, having signs that say, Japs go away, we hate Japs, and, your whole country around you?
Besides making lifelong friends, the trip to Japan helped Barbara find her own place in the world.
It really changed me because it made the hyphen in being Japanese American really stand out. I'm Japanese by descent, I'm American by birth. And how do you reconcile the two? And so going to Japan, I realized when I got on the airplane at Japan Airlines that I was not really Japanese because the stewardess was talking to me in Japanese. I'm like, why is she talking to me in Japanese? Remember, I'm from Idaho. I realized that I wasn't Japanese, and I go, well, then who am I? I was American, but never did feel American. And so that hyphen just really accentuated itself, stood out at that time a lot more. And it helped kind of define my identity. And then I got married, moved to Paris, and then moved to London and Singapore. So that period of history was just raising children and traveling and whatever. We came back to England in 1990, and one of my kids' teachers was the AP history teacher, and he goes, Barbara, he says, your parents were involved in the relocation? I said, yeah. He said, can you come in and speak about it? I said, oh my gosh. I said, I don't know. But I put together a piece that was kind of the beginning of this PowerPoint.
So, for 25 years, Barbara has done what she can to keep the story alive.
Now they were taken to racetracks and fairgrounds where the Army almost overnight had built assembly centers. They lived here until new pioneer communities could be completed on federally owned lands in the interior. Santa Anita Racetrack, for example, suddenly became a community of about 17,000 persons.
So how did the United States ignore the civil rights of about 80,000 U.S. citizens and their extended families? It really all began early in the 20th century.
The Chinese came first. They were laborers, and they were getting some backlash because there's too many of them coming over. So they had a Chinese exclusion. So that brought in the entree for more Japanese to come. And there was a famine in Hiroshima, so a lot of Japanese did immigrate. So then pretty soon they're saying there's too many Japanese now coming over. So they were a much needed commodity at the beginning. So they did not they faced low wages, they faced a lot of things that many immigrants face of being used and abused, but it wasn't any worse than any other new immigrant coming in. As time went on, with more Japanese coming in, there were 72,000 Japanese in 1910. And a lot of them settled in the Central Valley of California, which is very rich in agricultural opportunities, but it wasn't utilized because a lot of the people didn't know how to farm. So the Japanese came in and made the ground very fertile, and it became very lucrative. So people started noticing and decided that Japanese were taking away farms from Americans.
In newspapers and politics of the time, the situation had a name: Yellow Peril. The fear that Chinese and then later Japanese would invade American land and disrupt Western values. But Yellow Peril also had an economic element. For instance, in California in 1940, using less than 2% of the state's farmland, Japanese farmers produced a third or more of the state's fruits and vegetables. Examples of their success were repeated the length of the West Coast. As the press drummed up fear about the Yellow Peril, the government took note as well. They did multiple studies. Was this population a threat if hostilities erupted with Japan?
So the Navy spent 10 years, called the Munson Report, spent 10 years studying the Japanese on the West Coast. In his report, they found that the Japanese were loyal to a fault. Not quite sure what that means, but to a fault. And the Immigration Department had a study, the State Department had a study. They all found that there was no threat of sabotage or fifth column movement in any study that they did on the Japanese community. There was not one act of sabotage, and after the war, there was not one Japanese American charged with sabotage. And that whole rounding them up was because we all look alike and we could be sabotaging this country.
This morning, a distant view, the battle off Pearl Harbor, and a severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese.
So what happened with the ferment and all the political shenanigans and press worried about Yellow Peril and all this stuff? When December 7th happened, it was the perfect storm. And this is what my parents and everybody on the West Coast began seeing. And as the Japanese became more visible as farmers and entrepreneurs, it got worse and the pressure got. The other thing that contributed to it was the Hearst newspaper. William Randolph Hearst just looked like a swell guy. He had this fantastic publishing empire. Well, yes, he did. And they were very, very strong in the anti-Japanese movement. I wanted to just have a quote. This is just one quote. There was so much vicious stuff going on in the papers, it just turned your stomach. Herd 'em up, pack 'em off, and give 'em the inside room of the Badlands. Let 'em be pinched, hurt, hungry, and dead up against it. Personally, I hate the Japanese, and that goes for all of them. The guy was a syndicated columnist in the San Francisco Examiner. The Seattle newspapers weren't any better. The Los Angeles Times, not any better. It was only in the last couple of years that the Los Angeles Times took out a full-page ad, as did the Seattle Times and the San Francisco Examiner, apologizing for their behavior during that period of time. So this is some of the cartoons that came out of that era. Terry and the Pirates, How to Spot a Jap. I have this magazine. It's Life magazine from December 1941. How you could tell a Jap from a Chinese. So what had happened during that whole period of time, they call it yellow journalism. So I'm not going to read through, but just look through that and see what resonates. So as you know, you say things long enough, loud enough, people start to believe it. And just vile cartoons and all kinds of things that really stereotype the Japanese, and things like DeWitt, General DeWitt, who was head of the U.S. Army bases in the Western Division, was quoted saying, "A Jap is a Jap no matter where they're born." So the idea that your race defines who you are and where your loyalties are. So that became embedded. So it didn't matter if you were a Japanese American, if you're a Japanese, or if you just looked Japanese, you were the enemy. This led to 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor was bombed, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which paved the way for the incarceration of 120,000 people of Japanese descent, 2/3 of who were American citizens. So these are the posters that went up. So there had been rumors for quite some time that something was going to happen, but my parents thought that if anything happened, it'd be to the Issei, to the grandparents, because they weren't citizens, never dreaming that anything would happen to them. And then they found out that it was going to be all Japanese. So they didn't know where they were going, if they're going to be executed, if they're going to be sent back to Japan. So you can imagine the rumors and the fear that was going around.
To enforce Order 9066, exclusion zones were established on the West Coast, primarily around military facilities, but actually the whole West Coast.
All persons of Japanese descent were required to register. They gathered in their own churches and schools, and the Japanese themselves cheerfully handled the enormous paperwork involved in the migration.
As the evacuation proceeded, there was little opposition, even from the Japanese.
As I started researching more about what happened to my parents, I then began to appreciate a bit more the sacrifices they made, and they had little option. They had very little option of other than to surrender. And some people did make noise, not too many, but the ones that made noise were ostracized again by the Japanese community, because you're not supposed to make noise and be noticed. March 30th, the first people that were taken away were the people on Bainbridge Island. 275 people were marched off of Bainbridge Island. They had 1 week's notice. This is a very iconic picture, and it says it all. This woman with her baby in her arms. Notice the baby has a tag. Everybody that was incarcerated had a tag with their numbers on it.
Soon after the island was empty of Japanese, exclusion orders went up in Pierce County. In May of 1942, Barbara's family was told to leave their small farm in Fife, Washington.
Can you imagine disposing of everything that you own? Your animals, your possessions, everything, and you have 2 suitcases. And my sister was 18 months old at the time.
Their destination was an assembly center, Camp Harmony, temporary lockup while the Army prepared more permanent housing.
So they opened up the livestock stall, so you can imagine how fast and how hastily they did this. My mother said they moved in April, and they said the weather was atrocious. And of course, there's no sidewalk, so it was like mud. The sanitation, there was no time to build toilets or any kind of sanitary conditions. So it was very, very crude and humiliating. So the conditions and the regard for human dignity was totally absent. And then in August, they were put on trains with blacked out curtains and sent a long ways away. Well, they ended up in Minidoka, Idaho.
Within months of Pearl Harbor, the government opened 10 camps in some of America's most desolate locations. Minidoka, rising from Idaho desert, eventually held 13,000 Japanese Americans.
And so my mom says she got off the bus and she looked out and it was just dusty and hot. And then the buildings were put up so hastily you could see daylight in between the planks. So she said it was very, very difficult. So my parents were sent to Minidoka. Many of them stayed there 3.5 years, my grandparents. But they were short of agricultural labor in Montana. And so, because my dad was a farmer, he elected to go to Montana. Some only went for the short beet crop, but my parents stayed for the 3.5 years, moving from farm to farm. My mother said she got paid $12 a month.
Barbara, with husband Ed, had answered many of the troubling questions she'd had as a young girl. But one story was still unexplored. What more could she learn about Uncle Yohei, the comforting face from her childhood? She learned that in 1942, as Yohei was adjusting to Minidoka, an angry group of soldiers in Hawaii want to join the fight, their ranks soon to include Yohei.
Now I'd like to talk about the 442nd. It's a very famous combat team. Started out in Hawaii.
A National Guard unit containing many Hawaiians of Japanese descent was clamoring to get into the war against the Japanese.
So when Pearl Harbor was bombed, they went into high gear, very loyal, and really angry at the Japanese. And so they thought they'd see combat pretty soon. And then one day, their commanding officer said that they'd been disbanded. It's because they're Japanese, the ones that were Japanese. So one of the officers said, they're really good fighters, why don't we let them just train? So they let them continue training, and they started noticing that these guys are pretty good. And maybe we should let them fight, but we can't let them go to Japan because they may work for the enemy. So we could send them to Europe. That was the seed of the thought of the 100th and 442nd.
By 1944, the government changed policy on Japanese Americans in the military. Men previously classified undesirable were now signing up or being drafted right out of the camps. But before a legendary all-Japanese fighting unit could take shape, the young soldiers first had to stop fighting each other.
So they were sent to places like Camp Shelby in Arkansas for basic training. So they had people from the Hawaiian Islands and then people from the mainland. The Japanese on the mainland were called Katonks because the Hawaiians said that's the sound of an empty coconut shell hitting the ground. And so the Japanese on the mainland thought these guys were stupid from Hawaii because they couldn't speak proper English. And then the Hawaiian Japanese thought that the Japanese Americans are very arrogant. So a lot of misunderstanding in those two groups. So things got to such a head that the officers in charge were saying, you know what, maybe this was a bad idea. Maybe we just disband this whole unit. A pastor, one of the pastors, decided that he'd try an experiment. And he had the Hawaiian group go to one of the incarceration centers in Alabama. And so they had their guitars and they were singing songs and just enjoying themselves. They get off the bus and they're confronted with this barbed wire. And they go, what? And they look inside and they are Japanese Americans speaking English. And it began to dawn on them that these are the brothers and sisters and family members of the Katonks. They had no idea that the Japanese in America were rounded up and incarcerated. So they got back and they decided they're going to be one fighting unit. And they said they all had something they had to prove. And so they decided their motto was going to be go for broke, and they became one fighting unit.
The highly motivated 442nd's first overseas assignment is Italy. They fight heroically, and within months they're in France, in need of reinforcements. And that's where two young soldiers fresh out of boot camp, Yohei Sagami and his friend Joe Sakato, join up with the Go for Broke Battalion.
It wasn't until 2014 that I decided, we're going to go to Europe. And I want to really find out more about my uncle.
Barbara discovered Yohei must have been killed in the battle for Bruyères, the 442nd's major action in France. And then another piece fell into place.
I had an excerpt from a book called Just Americans that my aunt had sent me. And it was a narrative from a guy named Joe Sakato. saying that he was with my uncle Yohei when he was killed.
Joe Sakato won the Medal of Honor for valor in France, leading a charge, rallying others to follow.
And he said he's still alive. So Ed and I jumped on an airplane, flew to Denver, and met Joe. He was 90.
How long did you know Joe, did you know him, Joe, before you guys were in?
We took basic training together.
Basic training, huh?
At Camp Blanding, Florida.
Oh, okay.
At Camp where? He absolutely the most wonderful person, not a bitter bone in his body. And he was very humble, and he said, kept reiterating, I'm not a hero. The heroes are back there. And then he told me that the only way he can get it out of his head was to talk about this.
Joe's time in war was brief and horrifying, his memories turning in his head and onto paper. Injured in battle, he was in and out of the war in little more than 2 weeks. But he saw a lot. His friend Yohei was killed on their first day of combat. Joe earned the Medal of Honor as he and the 442nd rescued the lost battalion of Texas. Told to rescue the battalion at all costs, the 442nd suffered hundreds of casualties while rescuing 211 men. The rescue raised questions whether the 442nd was being used as cannon fodder.
Then he told me about my uncle. I said, I never met him. And he said he was really nice. He goes, he was very quiet. And he said he had a sense of humor, and he really missed his mom.
In her presentation, Barbara gives voice to the letter she scrawled on as a child. The letter is to Barbara's mother. She is still under house arrest and working in Montana fields. Yohei is in Maryland, about to ship out for France. 2 months later, he's killed.
Dearest Michi. Hello, sis. And I do mean dearest, no lie. It's a hell of a time to be writing you a thank you letter, but I suddenly realized how swell you've been to me and all the brothers and sisters for that matter. And you've also been grand to Mom and Dad.
It's a letter that a lot of young servicemen, when they're sending home their insurance papers, they reflect on their childhood.
Remember how we used to fight back home? God, it used to be that we couldn't even ask each other a favor without getting some back remark. I think about the home that we used to have from now until doomsday. I mean, some incidents were unpleasant. But if I had another life to live, I'd like to live the same old life all over again. Only, I may be a little worse. Is that possible?
He says, although some things weren't pleasant, because they were very, very poor, they experienced a lot of discrimination. And they had hardships. There were 10 kids in the family. But then he says he wouldn't trade out life for anything. I think he's looking back and he's just grateful that he had the family and a mother and sisters and brothers.
I only wish that Mom could read English, for then I can at least attempt to express my appreciation for her and how often I think of her. Try to tell her, will you? For I do love her.
So I just thought that was a really wonderful letter from him.
The last contact with Yohei was a scarf he sent to his mother from Nice, France. From there, Yohei would have advanced north with the rest of the 442nd to engage in the battle to free Bruyere. Joe Sakato's account of their first day of battle is reported in Robert Asahina's book, Just Americans.
Suddenly, the sound of artillery became louder. Sakato heard himself yell, "Incoming!" And the next thing he knew, he was lying 10 feet away from the tree he had just been leaning against. He checked himself for wounds, then looked back and saw Sagami lying motionless on the ground.
Right.
A stream of blood as thick as a pencil was spurting from the wound at the base of his neck. Sakato tried to stop the blood from coming out, but realized he would have to choke him to stop it.
Right.
He hollered for the medics, who gave him some plasma, but he died on the way down the hill.
He lost too much blood.
Yeah.
His blood was just streaming everywhere.
The Japanese-American 442nd Regimental Combat Team would go on to distinguish themselves as the most decorated fighting unit for its size and length of service in the war. It earned over 14,000 awards, of which more than 4,000 were Purple Hearts.
This house, you see, with not the gray roof, but the red one behind.
In 2014, Barbara and husband Ed set out for France, hoping to learn more about Yohei. With key details from Joe Ciccato, French guide Hervé Cladone located the place where Yohei died. The all-Japanese 442nd are heroes here for driving out the German invaders. Yohei was the first Nisei soldier killed in the Battle of Bruyere.
So the village that was near there put up a plaque for my uncle. This is the ceremony. They had a big ceremony. They had the director of Epinal Cemetery, the mayor of the village, and the mayor of Bruyere, and a lot of free French there. They had a lot of that time in 2014 free French that were older, and they remembered the Japanese coming in. And they tell us about how they met the Nisei. And these are the people that were teenagers, and they knew the mountains. And so when the 442nd came, the Germans were scouts on 7 different hilltops, and they had their guns pointing down. So the guy that's pointing his finger was a forester. He was a teenager, and he helped guide the 442nd up through the terrain. The woman on the left, she was 14 years old, and so she was told that the Americans were going to come and liberate Bruyere. So she goes, okay. So she goes to this field, and she said the trucks would come in slowly, and the Nisei would roll out. And so they were looking for Americans, and they go, they look funny. They're short, they have dark hair, and they have funny eyes. And then somebody said they're Hawaiian. So I've been to France a number of times. Every time I go, I'm introduced as Hawaiian.
In 2016, Barbara and Ed were invited back for the unveiling of a granite monument honoring Yohei. And she was pleased to find that a letter she'd written Yohei 2 years earlier and hidden behind his plaque would be part of the new monument.
The mayor instructed the stonecutter to carve a niche at the base of the monument, and he gave me a vial and had me inserted into the monument. So I write this letter, and you know when you write something, you just feel like this is really cheesy, and you do it anyway. So I wrote this letter, and I updated Uncle Yohei on what's going on. 2 nephews named after him. Every time we have a family reunion, his picture's there, and he's remembered. I put a picture of Grandma Sagami in there. I said, she looks a little different now, but she never got over your death. And I said, you'll always be remembered in our family. And I placed it in the monument, so it'll always be with Uncle Yohei. So maybe it wasn't so cheesy after all.
As war ended and the camps closed, most of the released Japanese Americans' only possession was the clothes on their back. Unable to pay taxes, many lost property. They were starting over. By the 1980s, Japanese Americans were still looking for justice when there was a breakthrough. It was discovered that government attorneys, prior to the incarceration, had withheld and altered evidence favorable to Japanese Americans and made false claims that Nisei were threats.
So the government made an apology to the Japanese, and they gave $20,000 for each person that was incarcerated, that was still alive. So I have some other statistics that talked about how much people lost, but let's just say for most people they lost everything. With this money, my father, he goes, wow, great, and he was happy. My mother, on the other hand, it opened wounds that were so deep, it was just like ripping off scars that had been there for so long. And she was furious beyond reason. And she never settled down. It just opened up a wound that had been buried for so long. So people had different reactions to that $20,000. And everybody understands in no way did it make up for the gross injustice. Out of tragedy and out of what seems like hopelessness, sometimes you look for things of beauty. They had arts and crafts that the government supplied because they wanted people to do something. And that's where the art of gammon is. So the art of gammon, so there were some beautiful things that did come out of this dark period. My friend at a book club brought this magazine, and it's the National Parks magazine. And I go, I have those birds. My mom gave them to me, and she says, Grandpa made those in camps. So I went, never connected camps with Grandpa and the incarceration. So I went and found them, and I said, oh my gosh, these are treasures. My grandfather, who is a farmer, made 4 of these chests. They're beautiful. And when I was growing up, it was in the entryway, and it was just as it gathered dust. My dad put his shotgun shells because he used to go duck hunting. So we just thought it was just something Grandpa made. Then I found out the history of it. So now this is a precious heirloom. 2 family heirlooms out of junk. I just think it's important for my generation, my children, and future generations to understand our history, what happened, and we can't fix it, but if we understand it, we could say ways that we can go forward. None of this would have happened if we didn't have racism and a lot of things going on. I didn't know about Juneteenth. I didn't know about the Tulsa Massacre. There's so many things I didn't know about. So at this point, why I'm standing before you is that we need to remember our history. And all of you, I don't know how many of you come from immigrant families, or your parents are immigrants, or your grandparents are immigrants, but all of us came from somewhere else. So we all have a story to tell. And we talk about immigration and hordes of people and infecting our country, and words that just really have, they may not seem, they seem a little strident, but the power of those words have great depth. I end with this. History is not simply an exercise in learning about the past. It provides an opportunity to understand how we arrived at our present and the path that will pave us into the future.
500 proud members of the 442nd Infantry Regiment, mostly American-born Japanese, swings down Constitution Avenue in Washington for another ceremony in their honor. Nisai hear President Truman's tribute.
You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you've won.